The courthouse stood tall and imposing against the gray morning sky. People walked in and out of its heavy wooden doors, each carrying their own stories of justice sought or justice served. Inside courtroom number 7, Judge Margaret Harrison sat behind her mahogany bench, her black robes flowing around her like a shield of authority. She was known throughout the county as a fair but firm judge who never tolerated nonsense in her courtroom. On this particular Tuesday morning, the docket was full of routine cases. Traffic violations, small claims disputes, and minor criminal matters filled the schedule. Judge Harrison had been presiding over cases for nearly 20 years, and she thought she had seen everything the legal system could throw at her. Little did she know that this ordinary day would become one she would never forget. The first few cases proceeded without incident. A speeding ticket was dismissed due to faulty radar equipment. A neighbor dispute over a fence was settled through mediation. Judge Harrison moved through each case with practiced efficiency, her voice echoing clearly through the courtroom as she rendered decisions and set hearing dates. Around 10:30 in the morning, a commotion arose near the back of the courtroom. The bailiff, a tall man named Officer Robert Martinez, was escorting a defendant to the holding area when a group of protesters began shouting from the gallery. They were family members of a victim in an upcoming case, demanding justice for their loved one. Their voices grew louder and more aggressive as they stood from their seats. Officer Martinez immediately moved toward the disturbance, his hand instinctively reaching for his radio to call for backup. Judge Harrison banged her gavel firmly and called for order, but the protesters continued their emotional outburst. The situation was escalating quickly, and everyone in the courtroom could feel the tension building. What happened next surprised everyone present. As Officer Martinez approached the protesters, one of them suddenly lunged toward the judge's bench, apparently trying to reach Judge Harrison. The man was clearly distraught and not thinking clearly, but his actions posed a potential threat to everyone in the courtroom. Without hesitation, Officer Martinez intercepted the man, placing himself directly between the angry protester and Judge Harrison. The officer's quick thinking and positioning prevented what could have been a dangerous situation. He managed to calm the man down using de-escalation techniques he had learned during his years of service, speaking in a low, steady voice while maintaining a safe distance. Other court security officers arrived within moments, but Officer Martinez had already diffused the situation. The protester was peacefully escorted from the courtroom and order was restored. Judge Harrison took a brief recess to allow everyone to settle down and to ensure that the rest of the proceedings could continue smoothly. When court resumed, Judge Harrison looked directly at Officer Martinez, who had returned to his position near the defendant's table. She had witnessed his professional handling of the situation and was impressed by his calm demeanor under pressure. However, something else caught her attention as she observed the officer more closely. Pinned to Officer Martinez's uniform was a medal that Judge Harrison recognized immediately. It was a Purple Heart, awarded to military personnel who are wounded or killed in action while serving their country. The sight of this medal sparked her curiosity, and she found herself wondering about the story behind it. As the morning progressed through additional cases, Judge Harrison couldn't shake her interest in Officer Martinez's military background. She had always respected veterans and their service to the country, but something about this particular officer intrigued her. Perhaps it was the way he had handled the earlier incident with such professionalism, or maybe it was simply the presence of that Purple Heart on his chest. During the lunch recess, Judge Harrison made an unusual decision. Instead of retiring to her chambers as she normally did, she approached Officer Martinez in the hallway outside the courtroom. She complimented him on his handling of the morning's disruption and then, almost casually, mentioned the medal on his uniform. Officer Martinez's demeanor changed slightly when she brought up the Purple Heart. He became more reserved, his shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly. He thanked the judge for her comments about his performance, but seemed reluctant to discuss the medal. When she asked about his military service, he gave only brief, general responses about serving overseas. Judge Harrison found his reluctance puzzling. In her experience, most veterans were proud to share their stories of service, especially those who had been honored with medals for their sacrifice. She began to wonder if there was more to Officer Martinez's story than met the eye. The afternoon session brought more routine cases, But Judge Harrison found herself occasionally glancing at Officer Martinez throughout the proceedings. She noticed small details about him that she hadn't observed before. The way he carried himself suggested military training, with perfect posture and precise movements. His attention to detail was evident in how he monitored the courtroom, always aware of everyone's position and behavior. As the day wore on, Judge Harrison's curiosity about the officer's background continued to grow. She had served in various courts throughout her career and had worked with many law enforcement officers and court personnel. Something about Officer Martinez seemed different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Near the end of the day, as the last case was being concluded, Judge Harrison made another observation. When Officer Martinez thought no one was looking, she noticed him unconsciously touching the area near his left shoulder, as if responding to some old pain or memory. The gesture was brief and subtle, but it didn't escape the judge's trained eye. The workday ended with the usual administrative tasks and preparation for the next day's docket. As Judge Harrison gathered her files and prepared to leave her chambers, she couldn't stop thinking about Officer Martinez and the story behind his Purple Heart. She had developed a reputation for getting to the bottom of things, both in her courtroom and in her personal interactions. That evening, as Judge Harrison drove home through the familiar streets of her community, she made a decision that would change everything. She would find out more about Officer Martinez's military service and the circumstances that led to him receiving that Purple Heart. Little did she know that her investigation would uncover a story so powerful and moving that it would affect not only her own perspective but would eventually silence an entire courtroom when the truth was finally revealed. Judge Harrison spent the evening researching what she could about Officer Robert Martinez through public records and professional directories. She discovered that he had been working as a court security officer for 3 years, and before that he had served in the Army for 8 years. The basic information was readily available, but the details of his military service remained a mystery. The next morning, Judge Harrison arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. She wanted to observe Officer Martinez more closely and perhaps find an opportunity to learn more about his background. As she settled into her chambers to review the day's cases, she heard the familiar sounds of the courthouse coming to life around her. Officer Martinez arrived for his shift at his usual time, greeting his colleagues with quiet professionalism. Judge Harrison watched from her window as he performed his routine security checks, noting his methodical approach to each task. Everything about his behavior suggested someone accustomed to following procedures and maintaining high standards. The morning session began with a series of preliminary hearings for upcoming trials. Judge Harrison found herself paying particular attention to how Officer Martinez interacted with defendants, attorneys, and court staff. She noticed that he treated everyone with respect, regardless of their circumstances or the charges they faced. His demeanor was consistently calm and professional, even when dealing with difficult individuals. During a brief recess between cases, Judge Harrison decided to take a more direct approach. She called Officer Martinez to her chambers under the pretense of discussing courthouse security procedures. As they sat across from each other in her private office, she steered the conversation toward his background and experience. Officer Martinez answered her questions about security protocols thoroughly and professionally. When she asked about his military training and how it applied to his current position, he acknowledged that his Army experience had been valuable in preparing him for law enforcement work. However, he remained evasive when she tried to delve deeper into his specific military service. Judge Harrison's curiosity was now fully aroused. She had dealt with enough people over the years to recognize when someone was deliberately avoiding a topic. Officer Martinez wasn't being dishonest, but he was clearly uncomfortable discussing his military past. This only made her more determined to understand why. After Officer Martinez returned to his duties, Judge Harrison made several phone calls to contacts she had in the military and Veterans Affairs. She explained that she was trying to learn more about a court employee's background for professional development purposes. While she couldn't access classified information, she was able to gather some general details about his service record. What she learned both impressed and puzzled her. Officer Martinez had served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan and had been assigned to a unit that saw significant combat action. He had received several commendations for his service, including the Purple Heart, which indicated he had been wounded in action. However, the specific details of how he earned these honors were not readily available. The afternoon brought an unexpected opportunity for Judge Harrison to observe Officer Martinez under pressure once again. A defendant in a domestic violence case became agitated when his bail request was denied. The man began shouting at Judge Harrison and making threatening gestures toward his ex-wife, who was present in the courtroom as a witness. Officer Martinez responded immediately, moving with swift precision to position himself between the agitated defendant and potential targets. His actions were calm but decisive, demonstrating training that went far beyond basic court security protocols. The way he handled the situation showed tactical awareness and combat experience that impressed everyone present. As the defendant was removed from the courtroom, Judge Harrison noticed something she hadn't seen before. For just a moment, Officer Martinez's professional composure slipped, and she saw something in his eyes that looked like distant pain or memory. It was as if the confrontation had triggered something from his past, though he quickly regained his composure. After the incident, Judge Harrison made her decision. She would ask Officer Martinez directly about his military service and the story behind his Purple Heart. She felt that his reluctance to discuss it might indicate some unresolved trauma or difficulty that he was dealing with alone. That evening, Judge Harrison stayed late at the courthouse to catch Officer Martinez before he left for the day. She found him in the security office, completing his shift reports with the same meticulous attention to detail she had observed in all his work. When she asked to speak with him privately, Officer Martinez looked surprised but agreed. They walked to her chambers where Judge Harrison offered him a seat and closed the door for privacy. She began by expressing her appreciation for his professional service and his handling of the day's incident. Then she addressed the subject directly. She told Officer Martinez that she had noticed his Purple Heart and was curious about his military service. She explained that she had great respect for veterans and wanted to understand more about his background. She assured him that her interest was professional and personal, not official or investigative. Officer Martinez sat quietly for a long moment before responding. He thanked Judge Harrison for her kind words about his service, but explained that his military experience was something he preferred not to discuss in detail. He said that some memories were better left in the past and that he had moved on to a new chapter in his life. Judge Harrison pressed gently, explaining that she had observed his exceptional skills and believed his story might be inspiring to others. She mentioned that she sometimes spoke to veteran groups and community organizations about the importance of supporting those who had served their country. For the first time since she had known him, Officer Martinez showed visible emotion. His jaw tightened slightly, and he looked away from her direct gaze. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than usual, and she could hear the weight of something heavy in his words. He told Judge Harrison that his military service had ended differently than most soldiers. He said that the circumstances surrounding his Purple Heart were complicated, and that the medal represented both honor and regret for him. He explained that while he was grateful for her interest, the details of his service were something he had worked hard to move beyond. Judge Harrison realized that she was touching on something deeply personal and potentially painful for Officer Martinez. She assured him that she didn't want to cause him distress and that she respected his privacy. However, she also mentioned that in her experience, keeping difficult experiences bottled up could sometimes make them harder to bear. Officer Martinez thanked her for her concern but remained firm in his position that his military past was not something he wished to discuss. He stood to leave, his posture straight and professional despite the emotional nature of their conversation. As he reached the door, Judge Harrison made one final comment that would prove to be significant. She told him that in her years on the bench she had learned that sometimes the stories people are most reluctant to tell are the ones that most need to be heard. She said that if he ever changed his mind about sharing his experience, she would be honored to listen. Officer Martinez paused at the door without turning around. For a moment, Judge Harrison thought he might reconsider and open up about his past. Instead, he simply thanked her again and left her chambers, leaving behind an air of mystery that would continue to intrigue the judge for days to come. Over the following weeks, Judge Harrison found herself thinking about Officer Martinez more frequently than she cared to admit. His reluctance to discuss his military service had only intensified her curiosity. and she began to notice subtle details about his behavior that suggested there was indeed a significant story behind his Purple Heart. She observed that Officer Martinez sometimes seemed distracted during certain types of cases, particularly those involving veterans or military personnel. When a former soldier appeared before her court on a minor charge, she noticed Officer Martinez watching the proceedings with unusual intensity. His professional demeanor never wavered, but there was something in his expression that suggested personal connection to such cases. One morning, Judge Harrison received an unexpected visitor in her chambers. Colonel James Peterson, a retired Army officer who worked with veteran affairs in the county, had come to discuss a program for helping veterans navigate the legal system. During their conversation, Judge Harrison mentioned that she had a court security officer who was a veteran and wondered if he might be interested in participating in veteran outreach programs. When she described Officer Martinez, without mentioning his name, Colonel Peterson's expression changed noticeably. He asked for more details about the officer's service record, and when Judge Harrison mentioned the Purple Heart and service in Afghanistan, the colonel became very interested. Colonel Peterson explained that he had served in Afghanistan during the same time period and might know of Officer Martinez's unit. He asked if he could meet with the officer, suggesting that connecting with fellow veterans could be beneficial for everyone involved. Judge Harrison agreed to arrange an introduction, thinking it might help Officer Martinez open up about his experiences. The next day, Judge Harrison approached Officer Martinez about meeting with Colonel Peterson. She explained that the colonel was working on veteran programs and was interested in talking with court personnel who had military backgrounds. Officer Martinez's reaction was immediate and stronger than she had expected. He politely but firmly declined the meeting, explaining that he preferred to keep his military and civilian lives separate. When Judge Harrison mentioned that Colonel Peterson had served in Afghanistan around the same time, Officer Martinez became visibly uncomfortable. He asked her to please not share any information about his service with other people without his permission. Judge Harrison was taken aback by the intensity of his response. She quickly apologized and assured him that she would respect his wishes. However, the exchange left her with even more questions about what had happened during his military service that made him so reluctant to connect with other veterans. That afternoon, Colonel Peterson returned to follow up on their earlier conversation. When Judge Harrison explained that Officer Martinez had declined to meet with him, the colonel looked thoughtful. He asked her to describe the officer's appearance and any other details she could share. After listening to her description, Colonel Peterson sat quietly for several minutes. Finally, he told Judge Harrison that he believed he might know who Officer Martinez was, and if his suspicions were correct, the officer's reluctance to discuss his service was completely understandable. Colonel Peterson explained that there had been several highly classified operations during the time period when Officer Martinez served in Afghanistan. Some soldiers who participated in these missions had been sworn to secrecy about their activities, even from other military personnel. He suggested that Officer Martinez might be bound by security agreements that prevented him from discussing his service. This revelation gave Judge Harrison a new perspective on Officer Martinez's behavior. If he was restricted from talking about his military experiences due to classification issues, his reluctance made perfect sense. She began to feel guilty about pressing him for information that he might not be legally allowed to share. However, Colonel Peterson's next comment surprised her even more. He said that in some cases, soldiers who received Purple Hearts during classified operations had stories that went far beyond typical combat injuries. He mentioned that some of the most decorated soldiers from that period had experienced things that they carried with them long after their service ended. The colonel suggested that if Officer Martinez was indeed the person he thought he might be, then his Purple Heart represented extraordinary sacrifice and heroism that few people would ever fully understand. He advised Judge Harrison to respect the officer's privacy and to understand that some veterans needed to process their experiences in their own way and time. Judge Harrison thanked Colonel Peterson for his insights and promised to respect Officer Martinez's wishes regarding his military service. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to the story than even the colonel suspected. Several days later, an incident occurred that would begin to reveal the truth about Officer Martinez's past. A young veteran appeared before Judge Harrison's court on charges related to a bar fight. The man was clearly struggling with issues related to his military service, and during his hearing, he became emotional while describing his difficulties adjusting to civilian life. As the veteran spoke about his experiences in combat and his challenges with what he called survivor's guilt, Judge Harrison noticed that Officer Martinez had moved closer to the defendant's table. The officer's usual professional detachment had been replaced by obvious personal interest in the young man's story. When the veteran mentioned specific locations in Afghanistan where he had served, Officer Martinez's reaction was unmistakable. Judge Harrison saw him close his eyes briefly, as if the place names had triggered powerful memories. For a moment, the officer's carefully maintained composure cracked, and she glimpsed the pain he had been carrying. After the hearing concluded with the young veteran being referred to counseling services, Officer Martinez approached the defendant before he left the courtroom. Judge Harrison watched as the two men spoke quietly near the exit. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see that Officer Martinez was offering some kind of support or advice to the struggling veteran. When the courtroom had cleared, Judge Harrison called Officer Martinez to approach the bench. She asked him about his interaction with the defendant, and for the first time since she had known him, Officer Martinez spoke openly about his military experience. He explained that he recognized something in the young veteran that reminded him of his own struggles after returning from deployment. He said that some experiences in combat created bonds between soldiers that lasted long after the war ended, and that those who had been through certain situations had a responsibility to help others who faced similar challenges. Judge Harrison listened carefully as Officer Martinez spoke. She could hear the emotion in his voice and sensed that he was sharing something deeply personal with her. When she asked if his own experiences had been similar to what the young veteran described, Officer Martinez nodded slowly. He told her that his Purple Heart had come with complications that went beyond physical injuries. He explained that the circumstances of how he earned the medal involved decisions and actions that he still wrestled with years later. He said that while he was proud of his service, some memories were too difficult to discuss with people who hadn't experienced combat. For the first time, Judge Harrison began to understand the depth of what Officer Martinez had been carrying. She realized that his reluctance to discuss his military service wasn't just about privacy or security concerns, but about emotional wounds that were still healing. She thanked him for sharing his perspective and assured him that she respected his need to process his experiences privately. As Officer Martinez prepared to return to his duties, he made a comment that would prove to be prophetic. He told Judge Harrison that someday, when the time was right, he might be able to tell her the full story of his service and what his Purple Heart really represented. He said that when that day came, she would understand why he had been so reluctant to discuss it. Months passed, and Judge Harrison's relationship with Officer Martinez evolved into one of mutual respect and understanding. She had stopped pressing him about his military service, instead focusing on appreciating his excellent work and the quiet strength he brought to her courtroom. However, she continued to notice the small signs that suggested his past experiences still affected him deeply. One autumn morning, a case appeared on Judge Harrison's docket that would change everything. A local newspaper reporter named Sarah Chen had filed a Freedom of Information request seeking details about a military operation that had taken place in Afghanistan several years earlier. The case involved government transparency laws and the right of the public to access information about military actions conducted in their name. As Judge Harrison reviewed the case files, she noticed references to a classified operation known only by its code name. The government's legal team was arguing that releasing information about this operation would compromise national security and endanger individuals who had participated in the mission. The reporter's legal team countered that the public had a right to know about military actions, especially those involving American casualties. During the initial hearing on the case, Judge Harrison observed Officer Martinez's reaction to the proceedings. As the lawyers discussed the classified operation and read portions of heavily redacted documents, she noticed that the officer had become unusually tense. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by obvious discomfort, and he seemed to be struggling to maintain his professional composure. When one of the attorneys mentioned specific dates and locations related to the operation, Officer Martinez suddenly left his position and stepped out of the courtroom. Judge Harrison was surprised by this unusual behavior, as she had never seen him leave his post during a hearing except for emergencies. After a brief recess, Officer Martinez returned to the courtroom, but Judge Harrison could see that he was visibly shaken. His hands were slightly trembling, and there was a look in his eyes that she had never seen before. It was as if the legal discussion had opened old wounds that he had worked hard to keep closed. Following the hearing, Judge Harrison asked Officer Martinez to meet with her in chambers. She was concerned about his obvious distress and wanted to ensure that he was all right. When they sat down together, she gently asked if the case had somehow been related to his military service. Officer Martinez sat in silence for a long time before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He told Judge Harrison that the operation being discussed in court was one that he had participated in during his final deployment to Afghanistan. He explained that the mission had been classified at the highest levels and that he had never been able to discuss it with anyone, including his family. Judge Harrison felt a chill as she realized the implications of what Officer Martinez was telling her. The case she was presiding over involved the same military operation that had resulted in his Purple Heart. She understood now why he had been so reluctant to discuss his service and why the court proceedings had affected him so deeply. Officer Martinez continued speaking, his words coming slowly and carefully. He told Judge Harrison that the operation had gone wrong in ways that were still classified. He explained that soldiers had been lost and that the decisions made during the mission continued to haunt those who survived. He said that his Purple Heart represented not just his physical wounds, but the emotional scars that came from living with the consequences of that day. Judge Harrison listened with growing understanding and compassion. She realized that Officer Martinez had been carrying the weight of these experiences alone for years, unable to share his burden with anyone who could understand what he had been through. The legal case had forced him to relive memories that he had worked hard to suppress. As the Freedom of Information case progressed over the following weeks, Judge Harrison found herself in an impossible position. She had to rule on whether classified information about the military operation should be released to the public, knowing that her decision would directly affect Officer Martinez and other veterans who had participated in the mission. The government's legal team presented evidence that releasing details about the operation would endanger national security and compromise ongoing intelligence efforts. They argued that the classified nature of the mission was necessary to protect both military personnel and intelligence assets that were still active in the field. The reporter's legal team countered with arguments about government transparency and the public's right to know about military actions conducted in their name. They suggested that the government was using classification to hide mistakes and cover up actions that the public might not approve of if they knew the full truth. Throughout these proceedings, Judge Harrison watched Officer Martinez struggle with the knowledge that his most painful memories were being debated in public. She could see the toll that the case was taking on him, even though he continued to perform his duties with unwavering professionalism. One evening, as Judge Harrison was working late in her chambers preparing her ruling on the case, Officer Martinez knocked on her door. He asked if he could speak with her about the Freedom of Information case, explaining that he had something important to tell her that might affect her decision. Judge Harrison invited him to sit down, and Officer Martinez began to tell her the story he had never shared with anyone. He explained that the classified operation had been a rescue mission, designed to save American hostages who were being held by enemy forces. The mission had been planned carefully, but intelligence information had been incorrect, leading the team into a trap. Officer Martinez described how he and his unit had fought their way through an ambush to reach the location where the hostages were supposed to be held. When they arrived, they discovered that the hostages had been moved, and the building they entered was rigged with explosives. Several soldiers were killed in the explosion that followed, and others, including Officer Martinez, were severely wounded. The most difficult part of his story came next. Officer Martinez explained that in the chaos following the explosion, he had been faced with an impossible choice. He could try to save his wounded comrades, or he could pursue the enemy fighters who were escaping with information about American military tactics and personnel. He had chosen to save his fellow soldiers, carrying 3 wounded men to safety while under enemy fire. His actions had saved their lives, but the enemy fighters had escaped with intelligence that later resulted in additional American casualties in other operations. Officer Martinez had received the Purple Heart for his wounds and his heroism in saving his comrades, but he had never forgiven himself for letting the enemy escape. Judge Harrison listened to this story with growing amazement and respect. She realized that Officer Martinez's reluctance to discuss his military service hadn't been about modesty or security concerns alone. It had been about guilt and trauma that he had carried for years, feeling responsible for consequences that were far beyond his control. As Officer Martinez finished his story, Judge Harrison understood that her ruling in the Freedom of Information case would affect more than just legal precedent. It would determine whether the painful details of this operation would become public knowledge, potentially affecting the privacy and emotional well-being of all the veterans who had survived the mission. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, and Judge Harrison knew that whatever decision she made would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Judge Harrison spent sleepless nights wrestling with her decision in the Freedom of Information case. The legal arguments on both sides were compelling, but her conversation with Officer Martinez had given her insight into the human cost of making classified military operations public. She understood now that her ruling would affect real people who had already sacrificed so much for their country. As she prepared for the final hearing in the case, Judge Harrison made an unexpected decision. She would ask Officer Martinez to be present in the courtroom when she announced her ruling, believing that he deserved to hear her decision firsthand, given his personal connection to the operation in question. When Officer Martinez arrived for his shift on the morning of the final hearing, Judge Harrison informed him of her request. She explained that while she couldn't discuss the details of her ruling in advance, she wanted him to understand that his story had helped her consider all aspects of the case more thoroughly. Officer Martinez thanked Judge Harrison for her consideration but expressed concern about being in the courtroom during the hearing. He explained that listening to public discussion of the operation continued to be difficult for him, and he worried about his ability to maintain his professional composure during what promised to be an emotional proceeding. Judge Harrison assured Officer Martinez that she understood his concerns, but she gently insisted that his presence would be important for reasons that would become clear during the hearing. She promised that if he became too uncomfortable, he could step out of the courtroom without any professional consequences. The courtroom was packed for the final hearing, with representatives from the media, veterans organizations, government officials, and members of the public all present to hear Judge Harrison's ruling. The case had attracted significant attention because it involved the balance between national security and government transparency, issues that were important to many different groups. As Judge Harrison took her place behind the bench, she looked out over the crowded courtroom and spotted Officer Martinez at his usual position near the back. She could see the tension in his posture and knew that this moment was as difficult for him as any he had faced since returning from military service. The attorneys for both sides made their final arguments, reiterating the points they had made throughout the proceedings. The government's lawyers emphasized the ongoing security concerns and the potential danger to military personnel if classified information was released. The reporter's attorneys stressed the importance of government accountability and the public's right to understand military actions conducted in their name. When the arguments concluded, Judge Harrison began to deliver her ruling. She started by acknowledging the complexity of the case and the valid concerns raised by both sides. She explained that cases involving classified military operations required careful consideration of competing interests and values. Then Judge Harrison did something unexpected. Instead of immediately announcing her decision, she began to speak about the nature of military service and the sacrifices made by soldiers who serve in classified operations. She talked about the difficulty of balancing the public's right to information with the privacy and security needs of military personnel. As she spoke, Judge Harrison's eyes moved to Officer Martinez, and she saw that he was listening intently to her words. She continued by explaining that military operations often involved split-second decisions made under extreme pressure, and that the consequences of these decisions could affect soldiers for the rest of their lives. The courtroom was completely silent as Judge Harrison spoke about the weight of responsibility carried by military personnel who participate in classified operations. She explained that these soldiers often return home with stories they cannot tell and burdens they cannot share, even with their families and closest friends. Then Judge Harrison made a statement that surprised everyone present. She said that before making her ruling, she wanted the court and everyone present to understand that real people were affected by classified military operations, not just abstract concepts of national security or government transparency. Judge Harrison announced that she had learned, through her role in this case, about one soldier who had participated in the operation being discussed. She explained that this individual had demonstrated extraordinary courage and sacrifice during the mission, saving the lives of fellow soldiers while suffering severe wounds himself. Without mentioning Officer Martinez by name, Judge Harrison described his actions during the classified operation. She told the courtroom about his impossible choice between pursuing enemy fighters and saving wounded comrades, and how he had chosen to risk his own life to carry 3 injured soldiers to safety. As Judge Harrison spoke, Officer Martinez realized that she was telling his story to the entire courtroom. He felt a mixture of emotions, including surprise, embarrassment, and a strange sense of relief that someone finally understood what he had been through. Judge Harrison continued by explaining that this soldier had received the Purple Heart for his wounds and his heroism, but that he had carried guilt and trauma from the mission for years afterward. She described how he had been unable to discuss his experiences with anyone, bound by classification requirements and haunted by memories of decisions made under impossible circumstances. The courtroom remained completely silent as Judge Harrison spoke. Many people in the audience were moved by her description of the soldier's sacrifice and the ongoing burden he carried. Some began to understand that military operations involved real human costs that extended far beyond the immediate mission objectives. Then Judge Harrison made an announcement that shocked everyone present. She said that the soldier she had been describing was present in the courtroom at that very moment, serving as a court security officer. She asked Officer Martinez to step forward and join her at the front of the courtroom. Officer Martinez was stunned by Judge Harrison's request. He had never expected his story to be shared publicly, and he felt overwhelmed by the attention that was suddenly focused on him. However, something in Judge Harrison's voice convinced him to trust her judgment, and he slowly walked to the front of the courtroom. As Officer Martinez stood beside Judge Harrison's bench, she continued speaking about his service and sacrifice. She explained that his story exemplified the complexity of military operations and the personal cost of the decisions soldiers were required to make in combat situations. Judge Harrison then addressed Officer Martinez directly. Speaking to him in front of the packed courtroom, she told him that his service to his country had been exemplary, and that his actions during the classified operation had demonstrated the highest ideals of military service. She said that his willingness to sacrifice his own safety to save others represented the best of what it meant to be a soldier. With the entire courtroom watching, Judge Harrison did something unprecedented. She asked Officer Martinez to remove his Purple Heart from his uniform and hand it to her. Confused but trusting, Officer Martinez complied with her request, unpinning the medal and placing it in the judge's outstretched hand. Judge Harrison held the Purple Heart up for everyone in the courtroom to see. She explained that this medal represented not just one soldier's wounds, but his courage, sacrifice, and the ongoing burden he carried from his service. She said that the medal was a reminder that military operations affected real people in profound and lasting ways. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Judge Harrison prepared to announce her ruling in the Freedom of Information case. Judge Harrison stood holding Officer Martinez's Purple Heart, her eyes moving across the silent courtroom. The weight of the medal in her hand seemed to represent the gravity of the decision she was about to announce. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when the human cost of military service was being revealed in the most personal way possible. Looking directly at Officer Martinez, Judge Harrison began to speak about the true meaning of sacrifice. She explained that the Purple Heart in her hand represented more than just physical wounds sustained in combat. It symbolized the emotional and psychological scars that soldiers carried, long after their physical injuries had healed. Judge Harrison told the courtroom that Officer Martinez had earned this medal during an operation that had required him to make choices that no person should ever have to make. She explained that he had chosen to save his fellow soldiers instead of pursuing enemy fighters, a decision that had saved lives but had also resulted in consequences that haunted him years later. As she spoke, tears began to form in Officer Martinez's eyes. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he was hearing someone publicly acknowledge not just his heroism, but also the burden he had carried in silence. Judge Harrison's words were giving voice to feelings and experiences that he had never been able to express. The judge continued by explaining that Officer Martinez had never spoken about his experiences because of classification, requirements, and personal trauma. She said that he had served his country with distinction, but that his service had come at a cost that few people could understand. The silence he had maintained was not from a lack of courage, but from a combination of duty and pain. Judge Harrison then addressed the courtroom more broadly, explaining that Officer Martinez's story represented the experiences of countless veterans who had served in classified operations around the world. She said that these soldiers returned home with stories they could not tell and burdens they could not share. Yet they continued to serve their communities in new ways. With everyone in the courtroom hanging on her every word, Judge Harrison announced her decision in the Freedom of Information case. She ruled that the classified details of the military operation would remain sealed, but that a redacted version of the report would be released that provided general information about the mission's objectives and outcomes without compromising security or revealing personal details about the soldiers involved. Judge Harrison explained that her decision was based on the need to balance government transparency with the protection of national security and the privacy of military personnel. She said that the public had a right to general information about military operations, but that specific details that could endanger lives or compromise ongoing security efforts should remain classified. More importantly, Judge Harrison stated that her decision was influenced by her understanding of the human cost of making such operations public. She explained that veterans like Officer Martinez had already sacrificed enough for their country, and that they deserved to have their privacy and emotional well-being protected from unnecessary public scrutiny. As Judge Harrison finished announcing her ruling, she did something that no one in the courtroom expected. Instead of returning the Purple Heart to Officer Martinez, she held it higher for everyone to see and began to speak about what the medal truly represented. She told the courtroom that this Purple Heart was not just Officer Martinez's medal, but a symbol of the sacrifice made by all soldiers who had served in dangerous and classified operations. She explained that the medal represented courage in the face of impossible choices, loyalty to fellow soldiers, and the willingness to bear personal burdens for the greater good. Judge Harrison then made an announcement that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. She said that Officer Martinez's story had taught her about the true meaning of heroism and sacrifice. She explained that real heroes were not just those who performed single acts of courage, but those who continued to serve others despite carrying personal pain and trauma. With the entire courtroom watching in stunned silence, Judge Harrison did something unprecedented. She removed her judicial robe and walked around to the front of her bench, standing beside Officer Martinez as an equal, rather than as a judge presiding over a courtroom. Judge Harrison pinned the Purple Heart back onto Officer Martinez's uniform herself, her hands shaking slightly with emotion. As she did so, she spoke directly to him, telling him that his service to his country and his continued service to the community as a court officer represented the best of what it meant to be an American. She told Officer Martinez that he had nothing to be ashamed of regarding his military service, and that the choices he had made under impossible circumstances had been the right ones. She explained that his decision to save his fellow soldiers had demonstrated the highest ideals of military service, and that any consequences that followed were not his fault or responsibility. As Judge Harrison finished pinning the medal to his uniform, Officer Martinez broke down completely. Years of suppressed emotion and trauma poured out of him as he wept openly in front of the packed courtroom. Judge Harrison put her arm around his shoulders, offering comfort and support as he processed feelings he had kept buried for so long. The entire courtroom remained absolutely silent during this emotional moment. Many people in the audience were crying as they witnessed Officer Martinez's breakdown and Judge Harrison's compassionate response. They understood that they were seeing something profoundly human and moving, a moment of healing and recognition that transcended the usual formality of legal proceedings. When Officer Martinez finally composed himself enough to speak, he thanked Judge Harrison for her words and for helping him understand that his service had meaning beyond his own guilt and regret. He told the courtroom that carrying his experiences in silence had been the hardest part of his return to civilian life, and that finally being able to share his story felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Judge Harrison returned to her position behind the bench and formally concluded the hearing. However, the impact of what had happened in the courtroom that day extended far beyond the legal ruling. The story of Officer Martinez's sacrifice and Judge Harrison's recognition of his service spread throughout the community and beyond. In the days and weeks that followed, Officer Martinez received support and recognition from veterans organizations, community groups, and individuals who had been moved by his story. More importantly, he began to connect with other veterans who had experienced similar trauma, finding healing through shared experiences and mutual support. Judge Harrison's decision to reveal Officer Martinez's story in the context of the legal case was later recognized as a masterful example of judicial wisdom and human compassion. She had found a way to protect classified information while also acknowledging the human cost of military service, and she had helped a wounded veteran begin the process of healing that he had needed for years. The courtroom, where these events took place, became known throughout the legal community as a place where justice was served with both wisdom and humanity. Judge Harrison continued to preside over cases with the same fair but firm approach she had always used. But everyone who worked with her understood that she had been changed by her experience with Officer Martinez and his hidden story. Officer Martinez continued to serve as a court security officer, but he also began working with veteran support organizations to help other soldiers who were struggling with similar issues. His story became an inspiration to many, demonstrating that healing was possible even from the deepest wounds of war, and that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when someone chose to trust another person with their pain. The Purple Heart that had once represented shame and regret for Officer Martinez became a symbol of pride and healing, reminding him daily that his service had mattered and that his sacrifices had been recognized and honored by someone who understood their true meaning.